Valentine and Kerrie Obert for joining us.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I want to begin, of course, by thanking Inside View Press for their continued sponsorship of the NATS Chats. And let me just share briefly about my two guests tonight. Kerrie Obert is the Director of Medical Arts and a clinical voice.
Anymore. Sorry, I'm going to stop you.
Oh,
That's
go ahead.
dated, but yeah, go. I was at Ohio State University for many, many years, but I'm not there now.
So, Kerrie, fill me in on the more current.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize that that's the bio that you had. I shouldn't say I'm not at Ohio State because I'm still on the faculty there. I'm just not a clinical faculty person anymore. But I did spend almost 20 years in the voice and swallowing disorders clinic there as a speech pathologist. And I'm now affiliated there for research purposes, so I run all my subjects there. But I teach at Capital University's Music Conservatory in contemporary commercial voice, and I'm on a research team in Japan and doing all sorts of things. So that's the more updated version.
Well, thank you. You do hold degrees in both musical theater performance and speech language pathology. So that's an important distinction.
That's
And
right.
you will be the keynote speaker at the Voice Geek conference in England this coming April.
Yes. Going to be talking about evidence-based music.
I love that. And you are an author of this fantastic book that I was just sharing. What an incredible resource. It was 2013, am I remembering correctly?
Yes.
Yes, and I just discovered it not too long ago, and it's a really wonderful resource for everyone. And I did want to mention the Get Vocal Now website that
Yes.
is science-based continuing education.
Yes, and that's geared for singers, speech pathologists, and voice teachers.
Okay.
So
My other esteemed guest tonight is Chadley Ballantyne, and I hope this is correct, Chadley. I know you're new at Stetson University, assistant professor of music. I just joined their faculty in Florida this fall.
Yes, that's correct.
So you had a warm, sunny Christmas while the rest of us suffered. You have a
For a week.
you have a BM in vocal performance from Drake and a master's and doctorate in vocal performance from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, correct?
Yes, that's
And
correct.
Chadley has already contributed to one of our NATS chats this fall when I had a conversation with Karen Brunson on the evolving singing voice, of which Chadley contributed to this book a great deal. It's an incredible book as well, and I encourage people to watch the archive of that chat. And he's also on the summer workshop faculty with Ken Bozeman and Ian Howell at the NEC Summer Acoustic Vocal Pedagogy. So welcome, both of you. It's a mouthful, and I'm sure I just barely scratched the surface. So let's do just a couple minutes of Beyond the Bio. So Kerrie, would you lead us off? Tell us what brought you to being Kerrie Obert.
Oh, well, I think like a lot of people who have gone into speech pathology with a voice specialization, I started in music and I have a degree in musical theater, as you mentioned. And I met a lady named Jo Estel and ended up becoming really interested in anatomy and physiology and gradually shifted my interest towards speech pathology and clinical work. And so, as I mentioned, I've spent about 20 years in the clinic scoping people. I've done thousands and thousands of endoscopies, and I would like to say, I guess I'm just past the halftime show or something. I don't know, but you kind of get to a point where you start saying, "Gosh, I really would like to share some of these things that I've learned." And some of these observations that I made. And I found myself saying in the clinic, I don't have time to do, to write or to do research. And so a few years ago, I made a decision to devote more time to research, teaching, and so I'm getting to pursue some of those interests that have kind of been, going in the back of my mind for a long time. And so I'm really excited to share what I've been doing tonight with you all.
We'll be the lucky beneficiary of that very shortly. And Chadley, lead us a little bit through your Beyond the Bio.
Sure. So I started getting into voice acoustics at the end of my time in grad school. I had heard these magical things about singers form a cluster and that all great singers had this thing that made their voices awesome. And I wanted to know more about it. And at around the time that I left grad school and I was continuing to work on my doctoral project, which was investigating the vocal technique of a French tragedian actor based on recordings of him from 1900. I was also teaching a really wide range of students in the Chicago area. It was everyone from like middle school age, high school, college, adult amateurs, adult professionals, young professionals. And even though my training was in classical singing, I was teaching musical theater, rock, metal, classical, folk, just about anything. And I was trying to figure out what actually caused all these differences between styles and how to help people find these styles in their own voice in a healthy, interesting, powerful way. And I owe a lot of gratitude, and I'm very thankful that during that process, during that time, I met several people who really helped me a great deal. I met Ken Bozeman over the course of 2014, 2015, and learned a great deal from him about how to apply voice acoustics. And he introduced me to Ian Howell, who has had a huge impact on my understanding of psychoacoustics, and really excited about the work that the three of us are doing going forward.
Love that. Thank you. And Ian will be my guest in March, I believe. So we'll be continuing that conversation. So tonight we're here to talk about twang, which has such an interesting history, both fact-based and not, because most people think of twang, I think, as a nasalized sound or something associated with country singing, but that's not what we're here to talk about, really. So, Kerrie, would you just lead us a little bit through the history of that word and what you know of it?
Sure. Well, I was surprised to learn, and I've only found this reference in the last couple of years. The term twang appeared in the literature as early as 1930. Sir Richard Padgett, I think that's how you say his name, wrote a book called Human Speech. And in that book, he was talking about trying to model by building a model out of India rubber and with corks and things inside this to model the larynx to create an American twang. And so we know he wasn't talking about a dialect. And I think sometimes we talk about, people will talk about twang as a dialect, or like you said, something that we hear in country or bluegrass music. And I don't know why everybody thinks Americans have twang, but maybe we do. I don't know. But at any rate, he was looking at twang, and he was also, even back then, questioning whether or not it was nasal or not. And in fact, did some studies putting cotton in his nose and things like that. But even in his book, he referenced an earlier study, and I kind of, how you kind of go down these rabbit holes. I ended up finding that study and found that study, and they didn't call it twang, but he said they were producing the same sound. So, I think they were also looking at twang. Maybe they didn't call it that then, but at any rate, we're really talking about a sound in the voice that is bright. And some people say this is a part of singer's formant, and some people say they're distinct. Jo Estel thought that it was a part of how we created singer's formant. And, her article in I think the late 1980s, 1987, she said, I think this is a part of what we do in the ringing voice quality, but perhaps with a lowered larynx, which kind of balances out the brightness of the sound. And in 2010, Sundberg said, no, I don't think so. I think they might be distinct qualities. But that, that study had one subject. So there are lots and lots of questions, lots to discuss about twang and singer's formant and kind of the overlay of these things. And I have an emerging theory about this that I'll be happy to share as we get a little bit further tonight.
Well, so Chadley, is this a good time to talk a little of the acoustics intro, or do we want to? Okay, go ahead, lead us off.
Little thing to say to add to that. So in a lot of in our pre-chat and kind of talking with Kerrie over the last year, it seems like one of the things we'll be focusing on is two like distinct types of twang tonight, and both of them deal with energy in the acoustic spectrum much higher than where we speak. It's high frequency harmonics, energy above 2,000 hertz, and the earliest I know of it being described was Hermann Helmholtz in 1863, noting that around 2,500 to 3,000 hertz, there was he heard it in especially loud male singing, and he described this part of the sound he was hearing as a clear tinkling of little bells or dissonant upper partials or a peculiar kind of tinkling. The singer's formant has been noted by several people since then, throughout the time between then and now. And one of the aspects of this, as far as twang, that has also been talked about and observed, and really my awareness of this side of it, I'm very thankful to Ian Howell. He brings a lot of this narrative into a narrative form in his article, Necessary Roughness and the Voice Pedagogy Studio in Voice Prints. From as we start adding more energy, more amplitude in the harmonics of the voice, from about the fifth harmonic up, that starts to sound rough. So the more amplitude above the fifth harmonic, the rougher it sounds. The lowest 8 harmonics will still resolve into the pitch to our perception. And harmonics above the 8th harmonic will be rough and won't resolve into the pitch. So another thing we could say we're talking about today is tinkling and buzzing.
Interesting. Now there's a title for a presentation or an article for sure. Great. So Kerrie, let's start to lead us through. Is twang the same as singer's formant? I mean, I know you said that some people feel it's different. What is your research showing us?
Well, in the clinic, twang is so useful. When we have people make those bright, ringy, brassy sounds, we just get so much projection potential for a very low effort. And, I love to show, there's this great clip of these Bulgarian singers, and, they're singing this, kind of sound, and they look like they could just fall asleep on the stage because they're not working. It's so easy. And, that's what this does for our voice. This twang really helps us project. So we use it with people who have vocal fold paralysis, for example, and it helps them get toward a more normal sounding voice. We also use it with hypophonic voices, or voices that are really weak or breathy. We use it with school teachers to help project over the unruly children in the room, and to not spend so much vocally. So, I was looking at twang a lot with the endoscope to see how they responded to it before we enrolled them in therapy. And often I was not seeing those characteristic area epiglottic narrowing that had been mentioned so often with singer's formant, the narrowed epilarynx, and even with the Joe Estel work on twang production. And so that really kind of launched my my line of questioning. What are we really doing? And what my research is showing is that we twang in at least 2 different ways. And I like to call it high twang and low twang. And high twang actually, when I was down one of those rabbit holes from Padgett's book, I found a reference to what I'm now calling high twang or pharyngeal twang. And that was a reference to a narrowing at the uvular apparatus. And in this reference, they talked about the pharyngeal walls coming together. And I thought, that's exactly, that's what I see. And so, when people get a high twang, they're narrowing the pharyngeal walls together, those pharyngeal constrictors. And the sound is very much kind of like this. And often that is accompanied by a higher larynx position, but it doesn't have to be. And I think this may explain why we don't see singer's formant sometimes in the soprano, because I think our sopranos and probably our tenors are using a little bit more pharyngeal narrowing, not to the extent that I just did, but maybe a little bit more of that. And they may not be using as much what I call low twang. Now, my low twang, I no longer think that the air epiglottic sphincter can narrow, because as speech pathologists, we're trained to look at swallowing. And in swallowing disorders, the literature is just really filled with cadaver studies. And I don't know what I did with my paper on that, but I brought a reference. One of the papers I read was from 1995, and it was 20 cadavers. And they looked at the muscle fiber of the air epiglottic sphincter, and they said, first of all, it's really not even named correctly because it doesn't attach to the epiglottis at all. So those muscle fibers originate at the arytenoids, and then they fan out into the palatopharyngeus, into the sides of the tongue. So there really isn't even the muscle capacity to pull the epiglottis posteriorly. So I think we can pretty safely say, and I've got another study that had 165 subjects. And that was another study where they looked at radiographs and fluoroscopy of swallows. And those subjects never had epiglottic retroversion unless the tongue was pushing the epiglottis backward. So in disordered swallowing, when the epiglottis goes back, it's always associated with the tongue. So again, I started kind of going, but, and I'm going to show a video in a little bit that shows that, sometimes that epiglottis is back. Like every time we say an ah vowel, the tongue comes back. As we know, it's a back vowel. The epiglottis retroflexes or pulls back and narrows the epilarynx, but it's not twang. Why isn't it twang? Why isn't it singer's formant? So these were some of the questions that I began to have. But just to come back to answering your question, I think the root of the tongue is really involved in creating what I call low twang. And it gives us a little different sound that I think is probably where we're getting that singer's formant energy. And some singers use a little bit of both. Some singers use predominantly one or the other. But they really do have kind of distinct sounds. And I think Chadley's probably, he and I have been talking about this for the last 6 months or so. And I think he's probably going to share some acoustic things. Am I right, Chadley? Do you have some things to share with us?
Yes.
Yeah.
And before we go to there, so that our attendees are clear. So there's these two types of twang that you have identified, the high and the low. The high is really what you call a pharyngeal narrowing at the middle constrictor. You didn't say that tonight, but I know you've said that previously. Yes. That it's really a middle constrictor, and you feel like this twang is the most common. Do you still feel that way?
I think it's the most common in contemporary commercial music.
In contemporary, okay, good. Thank you for that. And the second, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kerrie.
Yeah, and I was going to say, and I think it's also the predominant strategy that sopranos use. Not all sopranos. I mean, I think of somebody like Renee Fleming, who has a little darker timbre voice, and I think she's probably using a little tongue, a little low twang in there as well. But we need to scope her to find that out.
Okay. But that, so the low, the opposite is the low twang, which is really more of a tongue root engagement to create this narrowing. Okay, so I just want to make sure everyone's on that. And let me, this may be a naive question, so forgive me, but tongue root and base of tongue?
The same thing.
Okay, I just want to make sure you see it different ways, and I've often wondered, when I read it, it appears the same, but I just want to make sure.
Yeah, so I really feel, and have begun to kind of say this out loud, that singer's formant is not because of the narrowing of the epilarynx.
Okay. Chadley, do you want to add to this, or do you want to show one of the videos to demonstrate what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think we can go into Kerrie's images and videos.
I think that's a great. And in fact, well, we're giving Chadley a second too. He's so graciously handling this. Kerrie, we have one question from Shannon who says, is it possible that sopranos and tenors have a physiologically more narrow pharynx as well? And this is in reference to your comment about narrowing of the pharyngeal wall.
I don't think so, but what I do think is that it might have to do with where our tongue is in relation to the epiglottis, because that strategy may not be as accessible if your larynx is a little lower than that root of tongue, or, you know, I kind of think it might have to do with not being able to access that low twang as easily as we can. I think absolutely everybody can, well, I think we can do both of these, but I think there's probably a physiological ease to doing the higher twang. It's probably a little easier for most of us to access.
Interesting. She says, so interesting, makes sense. Thank you. That's from Shannon Coates. Okay, Chadley, take it away.
Well, I guess we've got our a slide here. This is from Soonberg's landmark paper, 1974, on singer's formant, and I believe that was, I don't know, I know we had identified singer's formant before that, but I think that might have been the first time it was called singer's formant. And of course, he identified that the orchestra, the image on the left, is the spectrum of the orchestra playing, and the image on the right is the singing, or sorry, the image on the left is speech. I had to remember what I was looking at here. The image on the left is speech, and you can see that there's not a ton of energy beyond 1,000 hertz. There's a couple little mountains there at 2 and 3. But on the image on the right, when the person was singing, and this was with an operatic ringing quality, that we got a big boost in between that, right around that 3 kilohertz range. And this is what he called singer's formant. And can we go to that next slide? I just kind of wanted to refresh people's minds. And the theory was that this was due to what they called a narrowed epilarynx. And so I just wanted to show these images tonight for viewers who maybe are not as familiar with this. The image on the left is a wide open larynx, and we can see the vocal folds, we can see the arytenoids, the top of the epiglottis, and the aryepiglottic fold, that's that fold of tissue that connects the arytenoids to the epiglottis. And the idea was that there was muscle fiber within that aryepiglottic fold that could pull the epiglottis toward those arytenoids. And so the image on the right shows kind of a narrowed epilarynx, and that's what they said really created the singer's formant, that it created this resonator basically within a larger resonator, and this 6-to-1 ratio, that the pharynx was 6 times larger than the epilarynx, really created this boost in spectral energy that we hear. Can we go to another slide then? So as I mentioned, though, there are a couple of problems with this. The first thing is that the epiglottis never moves without the tongue moving. the tongue is always kind of in tandem with that. And I'll show a video of that here in a moment. This is an image of just a person saying E and ah. And you can see I've shown the tongue. I've kind of pointed to the tongue on the image on the right. And you can see that when we say ah, the epiglottis automatically retroflexes or pulls back and covers the larynx. And so in my mind, I found myself saying, why isn't ah singer's formant? Why isn't ah twang? If this is in fact involved in this, why aren't we doing this all the time when we say ah? And we know that ah is actually a hard vowel sometimes to get that ring on. It can be the elusive vowel. And then let's go to another slide. Okay, just to orient you to the pharyngeal area, I have highlighted the pharyngeal constrictor kind of with the blue line. And so the image on the left is without twang. And I've also circled in red an area called the puriform sinuses. And that's really just kind of a space. A sinus is the word for an open space. And you'll see that on the image on the right, that those spaces disappeared. The puriforms went away. And it's because those pharyngeal walls really encroached and kind of covered up the those puriform spaces. And so this is where, when I show the videos of the pharyngeal twang, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see kind of those walls creeping in, and it makes kind of this kind of shape, more like an inverted V. And then when there's not twang, that the walls kind of flatten out like they are on the image on the left. And then one more image. I think we have another slide, maybe.
Great images, Kerrie. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And again, when we see the tongue root pulling back, the vallecula is shown in the image on the left. The vallecula is another space that is between the tongue and the epiglottis. And in fact, that's a space that foods can kind of get caught in. It's a little pockety kind of area. But you'll see that the image on the right, that vallecula is not visible anymore. Because the tongue has pulled back into that space. And so as we watch the videos, these are areas that I will be kind of pointing out. Take a look at the vallecula, that space at the bottom, at the back of the tongue, or take a look at those puriforms, which are up toward the top of the screen. And those were those spaces kind of to the right and left side of the larynx. So
now that we're looking at video, can you go back and talk briefly about you talking about the muscle that you feel maybe has been misnamed because of the cadavers, looking at the cadavers, about the area epiglottic?
Oh, well, the area epiglottic muscle, I think, has been probably misnamed, and because it does not insert into the epiglottis. So, those muscles, area epiglottic, muscularis, I think is the name of that muscle. But it really should be called something like the aree palatoropharyngeus because it really fans laterally and inserts outside the larynx into the pharyngeal walls, into the side walls of the throat.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. How do you get a muscle renamed?
I have no idea. And unfortunately, there are a couple other muscles that probably are not named correctly either. And I don't know. I guess they just continue to be called that. I don't know. But it's a bit perplexing, yes.
We do have one question I want to pop in. Kate Baker asks, singer's formant has to be basically loud to get it. Is this correct? So it can be many things. No, this is.
Well, that might be a Chadley question.
In my opinion, it doesn't have to be forceful. It doesn't have to take a lot of effort to get. It tends to be there with loud singing. Some loud singing doesn't have it. So no, I think it's independent of loudness.
Mm-hmm. And I would say independent of fold mass. That doesn't, we looked at this many years ago. I was involved in a study looking at the contribution of the source to singer's formant. And it was unclear. That was kind of exactly the question we were asking. How loud do you have to be, or how much vocal fold mass has to be engaged in order to get singer's formant? And we, our study was kind of inconclusive, but we certainly hear ringing sounds, tinkling. I'll use that older term, tinkling bells. Especially with twang, we can certainly hear that with not a lot of vocal fold effort. And again, that's why we use it in the clinic, because we don't have to push at the voice in order to benefit from this quality.
Mm-hmm. Chadley, do you want to lead us into some of the acoustic videos that you have?
Kerrie's videos.
Or the acoustic stuff, Chadley, I think.
Okay, great. So, let me share my screen again. So I've been particularly interested in a couple aspects of this. One is using speech sounds to leverage some of these different formants. Formants 1 and 2, it's well known that they're the vowel formants. Formant 3 is quite movable with a retroflex R. Formant 4 needs to move to create the singer's formant cluster with 3 and 4. And depending on the voice type, you might see formant 5 coming into that cluster as well. So how do we move formant 4 has been one of my questions. Then the other thing that I've been interested in is comparing the signals for instance, comparing classical singers to contemporary singers, or classical soprano to legit soprano. Why do those sound different to us? Why does David Lee Roth sound different from Dmitry Hodovstovsky? So one of the things that I look for when I'm also differentiating between what we're talking about tonight with low twang and high twang is, for instance, in a signal from Dmitry Hodovstovsky or a classical baritone, I'm expecting to see a lot of energy in the singer's formant cluster area from between about 2,000 to 3,000 hertz, and then a sudden drop off called a piriform sinus notch. So those piriform sinuses that Kerrie pointed out, like anti-resonators. So when the pharynx walls are released and open and those sinuses are exposed, it causes a dampening above the singer's formant cluster. And so we get fewer powerful harmonics above that cluster. And going back to our, as we get higher and higher in the harmonic spectrum, if there's a lot of amplitude, they start to sound like noise or roughness or buzzing to us. They don't resolve into the pitch. So what I have up on Voce Vista, if you can all see the screen that I'm sharing, is a short clip of Dmitry Hodovstovsky singing Il Baleine. And you can see that really prominent singer's formant cluster between 2,000 and 3,000 hertz. And the display is set to 10,000 hertz. And you can see there's a sudden drop in amplitude of the harmonics above there. And comparing on the same scale of 0 to 10,000 hertz, David Lee Roth singing in roughly the same range, we have much more intensity in harmonics above 3,000 hertz. And in fact, in this recording, going on up to where they stopped the input at around 11,000 hertz. So once we start adding harmonics above harmonic 9 and above, we start to get more and more roughness, more and more buzz in the voice. So for example, roughly the same pitch range as far as they're singing. Dmitry Hodovstovsky is using that low twang. We get something like this. And when David Lee Roth is using the high twang, the narrowed pharyngeal walls to cover up those piriform sinuses so that we don't have the dampening or attenuation of the harmonics above the singer's formant range, we get a much rougher sound.
I live my life like there's no tomorrow.
And I think among teachers and among singers, there's been an assumption that that rough sound was completely due to vocal misuse and bad technique, when that, if you take a step back and think, well, we all know that style of singing the minute we hear it, and we all know it when we hear someone who does it well. And despite some pretty serious vocal health, overall vocal health and wellness issues with a lot of these singers, their singing lasted quite a while. So there's this signature that you're looking for in that type of rock singing, where we're getting that high twang compared to a classical baritone in the same range with the low twang. One of the things that I was really interested in is, what do these sound like? Can we hear the tinkling? And nowadays, that's pretty easy to do. That singer's formant cluster, this is a filter now, so that we'll only hear that range in Chorostowski. Here are the bells. And the vowel formant range below that singer's formant by itself, without the singer's formant, sounds like this. And together. And David Lee Roth, if we take all that roughness away, it won't sound like Chorostowski, but it won't sound as rough.
I live my life like there's no tomorrow.
If we isolate just all the roughness that is pharyngeal high twang is bringing in, there's our rough buzz. And I'm not satisfied to just let them have all the fun. This might be embarrassing, but this is me playing around with this earlier today, of switching between the low twang and then the high twang. So the singer's formant cluster is in the first take, and then the pharyngeal twang on the second take. And you can see the difference, especially above the range of the singer's formant cluster. In the first one, those top formants, 3, 4, and 5, are clustered very closely together. And on the second pass, when I'm using more of a rock style and pharyngeal twang, the singer's formant is actually no longer clustered. They're kind of spaced out evenly, so that I get even more amplitude in the harmonics above 3,000 hertz.
Good low twang.
And I recorded those back to back. And they take about the same amount of vocal intensity or output of intensity from my voice. No, the other one of them isn't more compressed or more strenuous. They're about at the same exertion level. Then I have a couple other things to compare, but we can look at Kerrie's videos next if you'd like.
Well, and Chadley, let me just, for a point of clarification, so we're not used to hearing the word, or at least I'm not, twang associated with the classical aesthetic. But in your wonderful comparison, when you talked about Dimitri, you used the word twang, and you talked about that low twang as Kerrie is identifying it. So essentially, the twang is replacing the word ring in this context. And because we're talking about some continuity of how we're acquiring the ring in the voice, correct? And so that it's the oscuro, or the dark, or like Renee Fleming, Kerrie mentioned earlier, the warmer, the oscuro part of classical singing. And you're just identifying that as with the word twang right now in this discussion.
Well, I would say that it's not actually the oscuro part, it's the chiaro part.
I'm sorry, yes. Except
Um,
but it is a warmer of the chiaro oscuro. It is still a
It's not as bright as the pharyngeal twang.
and it's not as, the frequencies aren't like, the energy for the high amplitude harmonics aren't as high. So they're not as bright, they're not as rough. There are fewer harmonics above the fundamental. So it isn't as rough, it's a more pure sound. And we have this balance of the darkness from the first formant, some brightness from the second formant, and a lot of brightness from the singer's formant cluster, and then a drop off after that. And so there are fewer, I have the Dimitri clip up again, there are just a fewer number of harmonics being radiated with a lot of amplitude. So it's a pure sound as far as roughness resolving into the pitch. Whereas David Lee Roth, it's pretty much evenly stacked amplitude harmonics all the way up. And if you look at Freddie Mercury, his regularly fill up all the way to 15,000 hertz. So it's adding more and more roughness as you keep adding in these higher factor harmonics at higher amplitudes in the radiated sound.
Okay. There's a couple questions coming in so that I think are relevant. D. Bruce Moore asks, the amplitude at the beginning of his opera voice was bigger at the beginning. Why? Am I asking that right, Bruce? Yeah, comment on the amplitude bigger at the beginning of Chadley's example of singing. Yes.
Just onset, the beginning.
You know, I was recording this directly into my computer, so I can't say that it was a perfect sound environment, but as far as well, in that opening part, when I'm doing the pharyngeal twang, it feels very, very low effort, and I try to keep them about at the same effort. There's a moment in there where I believe right about here is where it starts to get intense. I'm getting a pretty favorable acoustic matchup going through the top part of my zona di passaggio, where I'm going to get quite a big boost there right before I turn into the cover. So it could have been recording, just kind of putting this together as a demonstration, but it could also be that.
He said,
in general,
passaggio. He said, yes, going to passaggio.
Yes, and yes, and with the rock singing, what I've found is I've taught myself and my students and learned from some really awesome teachers that I've met through NATS. As far as the technique goes, you keep dialing back the amount of overall loudness or amplitude from your own sound, but you keep that intensity of the high twang. And that works really well with mic'd singing.
Okay. Kate Baker asks, why are we changing the terminology? I want to be clear with her. Which terminology, Kate, are you referring? I want to make sure that I'm not speaking on your behalf. And while we're waiting for her, there we go, twang and ring.
Well, I think twang has always kind of been used interchangeably with ring in some circles, maybe not all circles, but I have often heard it used as a component. You know, it is part of what makes ring. So I guess this is just my own, you know, maybe somebody will suggest a better term, but I kind of like high twang and low twang because it implies that it's not necessarily associated with classical singing. It could be in pop singing. It could be, you know, we would probably tend to use low twang more in classical singing, but I've got a lot of examples of pop singers who use it and commercial singers. So I don't know. I think that's an open topic still. I don't know that that's set in stone yet.
I think she's just feeling that twang is, in her words, twang is much more ugly and ring is hipper. So I think everybody has their relationship with words in the singing community, and I think it's a minefield, as we all know.
That's right. Send me your ideas.
Yeah, since you're going to be writing about it.
Right.
Good. Chadley, did I interrupt where you were headed? I wanted to just get some of these questions in.
No, we can either go to Kerrie's videos or go to the last videos I have.
Let me just, a couple of questions from people before we move on. So Jordan Reynolds says, for the singer's formant, are you saying it should be seen as more of a perceived loudness because of where it sits in the harmonic spectrum?
Our ears are more sensitive to harmonics in that range, but the pharyngeal twang has power in that same range as the singer's formant as well. It just keeps going on up past it. The singer's formant cluster, or as Kerrie calls it, the low twang, has a concentration in that 2,000 to 3,000 hertz range, and then a drop off after that. The pharyngeal twang has power there too, roughly in that range where our ears are really sensitive to those frequencies, but it just keeps going beyond that.
Okay. And Dan Mitten, maybe not where it sits in the harmonic spectrum, but aren't our cochleas configured to be extra sensitive to SFC?
Yes, and also the length and dimensions of our ear canal resonate those frequencies as they enter the ear.
Okay. Thank you, you guys. All right, let's go forward with the other samples, Chadley.
Okay, with mine or with Kerrie's?
Either, which.
Okay, well, I'll finish mine out real quick.
Yep.
So, let's see here. So the other aspect of this that I find interesting, besides just comparing like complete opposites like David Lee Roth and Dmitry Hodovsky, is understanding why Renee Fleming sounds different from Kristen Chenoweth singing the same song. So this first one it's from the same spot in Glitter and Be Gay, and this is Renee Fleming, and we see what we expect with a more rich, dark, pure voice as far as words we might associate with her voice, that there's a piriform sinus notch in the signal at about 4,000 hertz, and not a lot of energy in the harmonics, or not very many harmonics at all present above that. There's some sounds from the orchestra that appear there, and occasionally we'll hear her. So let's see. Lost my play button behind the chat screen. So here's Renee Fleming. And Chenoweth singing the same passage, and immediately we see much more intense, many more harmonics being radiated in the sound. When we look at 4,000 hertz range, we see that she is singing with a sound that has radiated harmonics going clear on up to 14,000 hertz. And in that same passage, that pharyngeal twang now helps create this version of the song.
Observe how perky I can feel about selling out to a movie deal. I'm popular, I top the list.
And what I really like about that clip is as she switches styles, you actually see those upper harmonics above 5,000 hertz start dropping out in intensity. The last one is comparing a legit tenor baritone, Philip Quast, to a contemporary tenor in Aaron Tveit. So this is Stars from Les Mis, and we see right away that singer's formant cluster pattern in the signal, where there's really strong energy, in his case, between 2,500 and 3,500 hertz. and an attenuation above that.
Safe behind bars, I will never let.
Compared to Aaron Tveit, sorry if I'm saying his name incorrectly, singing from Catch Me If You Can. And we can see on the screen that he's using pharyngeal twang. There are a lot more high amplitude harmonics above that piriform sinus notch. And it contributes to his voice being a distinctly different musical theater style.
Back and let me be your TV guide.
So these two different types of what we could call twang, low twang or pharyngeal twang versus singer's formant have a really big impact on style and how we perceive the voice, and even within, you know, the big comparisons of classical to rock or within different styles of musical theater.
Great, thank you, Chadley. And if there are any questions about that, I want to be sure to get to, there was another video that Kerrie had.
Yeah.
Singer.
I brought many videos.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Let's do.
Can we just show E-Ah? I think it's the first one.
We're going to run out of
Yeah.
time, so I want to make.
I just want to show this because, again, this is kind of where one of my bouncing off points that I don't think the epiglottis or the epilarynx is responsible for this singer's formant, because this is somebody just going E-Ah, E-Ah. And you'll hear there's no sudden boost in energy when they go to the ah, that we don't suddenly hear singer's formant. But you'll see that obliteration of the larynx, and you'll see that tongue epiglottis tandem motion as we watch this. Wait, one more time. There.
E-ah, E-ah. Yeah, that's amazing.
So that's a really typical finding. I mean, that's just the way that we work when we, and you know, I think, well, anyway, can we look at the next video? This is high twang or pharyngeal twang with those pharyngeal constrictors. Yeah, so you really see those walls of the pharynx just coming in, and you can hear the higher energy in the sound. And this person is also using a little low twang because the tongue is pushing back just a little bit on that epiglottis. It's hard to narrow those pharyngeal walls that much and not sort of also have a little bit of tongue involvement there. So, and then let's take a look at another video. I think I have maybe release, pharyngeal twang. And okay, so this is somebody sort of going in and out of pharyngeal twang.
You add it with root of tongue this time, so swallow.
Okay, and then I think I have one showing low twang.
And that's the tenor?
The root of tongue, the bottom one, the root of tongue.
The bottom one.
Yeah.
That is a wave file.
Oh, it isn't. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's look at Lafleur then. This Lafleur is a professional tenor who's had a great career, and he has a very omega-shaped epiglottis, so his epiglottis is already narrowed all the time. But what you'll see a combination here of pharyngeal twang and the tongue root, that low twang, or what I call tongue root twang, pushing back. And when when he releases it, when he goes to places that are softer, places where he wants to release the ring, you'll see that tongue pull forward and away, and that vallecula space will open up. So we can take a look at this as well.
que tu m'avais fait à ma prison cette fleur garde toujours sa douce odeur.
So there you really could see that tongue root pulled back. And I'm sorry the video was glitching a little bit. It was hard to pair up what you were seeing and what you were hearing. But I really think that tongue root, not only when it comes back, but because it comes back with all the time, but it comes back and it's also a little bit firm back there. And, you know, we're so frightened of talking about any energy in the tongue at all. I can just imagine listeners going, oh my gosh, you know, because, you know, pedagogically, I mean, we've got books written about releasing tongue tension. And so, you know, the front of the tongue can be doing something totally different from the root of the tongue. And you know, if we pull that root back too much, we get kind of a Kermit-y sound. But we can play around with that a little bit until we find that sweet spot. And, you know, like anything else, I think it's a matter of what's too much energy and what's not enough energy. And, you know, it's all about finding that balance there.
Do you cue your singers, Kerrie, to think about base of tongue, or do you just try and work on the twang, ring, whatever we want to call it, ping?
Well, I tell you, in my own singing, I only had pharyngeal twang, and I never really this has been so useful for my own singing, to kind of find some of those warmer, darker sounds that I didn't have before. And so it depends on the singer. You know, there are people who are just great at mimicking sounds and you don't even need to go there. And then there are those that you could mimic sounds for 6 months and they still don't get it. And then you pull out an anatomy chart and suddenly it clicks. But I have found playing around with those Kermit-y sounds and then reducing the amount of Kermit, you know, saying, well, now let's that a little bit. You know, but that sometimes helps them identify it.
Yeah.
And I've also used Chadley's trick of the weird kind of that overtone, working a little bit with that. But as I said, and you know, by the way, the tongue root goes below what we can see. Right. It goes below that vallecular space. There's tongue mass below that. Mm-hmm. And there's no way to really know even what's happening below. But like I said, I find, you know, when I say ah, and I've played around a lot with singers going from E to ah, then adding a little firmness, and then suddenly we have ring, and that we didn't have before. And so I think it's useful. Do you have anything to add, Chadley? Did you have any experience once you started playing with this?
Yes. So the Retroflex R that I've been playing around with, and I know some of the people that are in watching tonight, I've talked to you as well about your own experience using this as a teaching tool. The Retroflex will temporarily take away all twang, as if you go far enough into it. That action comes from a nearby part of the tongue, a little bit higher up than what Kerrie has observed. And what's been interesting is I noticed as we let go of it,
I don't know where that was coming from. Go ahead.
But that helped me, and it helped a lot of my students find the singer's formant cluster. I'd also used E to help build it. But then when I was talking to Kerrie over the last year about what she observing the involvement of the tongue perhaps a little bit lower than where it would be are a little bit deeper in the instrument. It made it easier for me to isolate moving the fourth formant around. And I've got a super short clip of me messing with that today. It is not associated with a speech sound, so it sounds a little goofy. But this is basically applying that low twang and releasing it, or starting from released and then applying it. And that's kind of in my singing range. And then this is up a little bit higher in a singing range from like a neutral vocal track, and then applying that low twang. And that the things that Kerrie's observed made it easier for me to isolate that and actually just be able to move that fourth formant around almost as freely as the ones we normally use for speech.
Fascinating. Well, you guys, I knew our time would go far too fast, and it indeed has gone way too fast. But we're going to have to leave it there. I cannot thank you both so much for this incredible work. And Chadley, a special thank you to you for handling all the videos and audios. Thank you so very much. And Kerrie, for your work, I can't wait to see how this rocks our world a bit. Such interesting work you've been doing, and I know people have already been talking about it for the last year or so on social media, so thank you for that. Let me remind our NATS attendees that the next NATS chat is February 10th with Lynn Helding and Lynn Maxfield, and we're going down the rabbit hole of motor learning and mindful voice, how cognitive science informs voice teaching. So that will be on our topics for discussion in February, and have a great rest of your January, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Chadley, Kerrie, just hang on for a minute, okay, and we'll have